Yeah, Mad Panic Gaming!
Let's party!
1994 was a banner year for fighting games, with such classics as Killer Instinct, Virtua Fighter 2, Tekken, and the King of Fighters 94 being released in rapid succession. It was like fighting game overload. But not to be outmatched, Capcom, the company that put competitive fighting games on the map, released what would be the ultimate version of their flagship fighting series, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and it blew everyone's minds. This is a game that was so good that it immediately made every previous version obsolete. It featured every character to have graced the series at that point, including the debut of the raging demon himself, Goki, aka Akuma. It featured updated visuals and sound, 3 different gameplay speeds to choose from, and for the first time ever in a Street Fighter game, bone-shattering super combos. This was truly the peak of Street Fighter at the time, but there was one major problem for kids like me. There was no way to play it. I grew up in a more rural area of the United States, so a trip to an arcade was indeed a rare occasion, and the only home port of Super Turbo at the time was on the 3DO, which, don't get me wrong, is actually a pretty damn solid port, but who the hell actually had a 3DO in 1994? They were ridiculously expensive and hard to come by, so once again, no Super Turbo for me. I had played every other version of Street Fighter 2 either in arcades or on the SNES or Sega Genesis, but it wouldn't be until several years later that I finally got to play this game on the PS1 as part of the Street Fighter collection, and I absolutely loved it. In retrospect, this is a somewhat broken version of the game.
It's like fucking Neo Geo conversion of Street Fighter or some crap, dude.
But 12-year-old me didn't really care. I was just happy to finally be playing some Super Turbo at home. Even as more and more Street Fighter games were being released, I could always go back to this one for some good fun. It's like an old friend that you've known for years, and once you're back together, it's like you never left. There aren't many games that 30 years after their initial release, there's still a devoted player base all around the world, but especially here in Japan. Walk into pretty much any arcade that hosts a community of fighting game players, and Super Turbo will almost always be on the menu. I dare say it's a perfect fighting game. There were updates to it later on, such as the HD Remix, which was really just a fresh coat of paint on an old classic, or Hyper Street Fighter 2, which let you play using any style from the previous iterations. But when playing Super Turbo is an option, why even play anything else? Anyway, this is a game with a legacy that will potentially outlive us all. It's one of the greatest fighting games ever made, and it definitely put Capcom's stamp on 1994. And then there was a movie.
Of course!
Actually, it would be more accurate to say that there were 2 Street Fighter movies released in 1994, but we'll get to that. For now, we're just talking about the live-action movie starring Jean-Claude Van Damme and Raul Julia, which is a movie that most people agree is bad, but for me, it's a pretty entertaining mid-90s action comedy. It definitely helps, though, if you just forget you're supposed to be watching a Street Fighter movie, which is easy since it feels more like G.I. Joe than it does Street Fighter. Probably because in the US, Street Fighter was literally being merged with G.I. Joe, with not just action figures, which were pretty cool to be fair. I just think Street Fighter 2 would be a very different game if everyone had rocket launchers, but also a Saturday morning cartoon that again featured all of the Street Fighter characters, but functioned more as a G.I. Joe style series, with a simple good guys versus bad guys story in each episode. Essentially, the point of the show was just to sell the toys, but it had its moments.
It's an incredible scene here in the Gaza. We are witnessing an attack by I'm not sure what it is, but seeing Arabs and Israelis unite to fight it may be a first, ladies and gentlemen.
Anyway, I bring all this up as a way to transition to what I think is the other less celebrated version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, that being Street Fighter the Movie, or as it's known in Japan, Street Fighter Real Battle on Film, which I think is a much cooler title. There is an arcade game also based on the movie, which itself is something of an oddity, but we'll save that for another day. For now, we'll just focus on the console game, because whether I knew it or not at the time, this was the closest thing I'd get to Super Turbo on the PS1 until finally getting the Street Fighter collection. It might not exactly look like Super Turbo, and it doesn't feature all of the characters, being that Fei Long wasn't featured in the movie, and the guy that played T-Hawk actually skipped out on recording for the game. On the plus side though, we did get Ernie Reyes playing Akuma as a secret character, and the one and only appearance of everyone's favorite Street Fighter character, Captain Sawada, played by an actor that would have played Ryu in the movie if he actually spoke English. Anyway, much like the movie, this version of Street Fighter is generally seen as being bad, but I tend to disagree. It's not perfect by any means, it has its flaws to be sure, but it is essentially a clunkier version of Super Turbo with digitized graphics and a seriously awesome soundtrack. Overall, not a terrible game at all.
Quick! Change the channel!
As for that other movie, 1994 also brought us Street Fighter the Animated Movie, which was and still is awesome. The story was compelling and easy to follow, all of the various characters were featured, and if you watched the English version, as I did when I was a kid, you were treated to a killer 90s rock soundtrack. It certainly did Street Fighter 2 justice, and most people don't know that it too was adapted into a game called Street Fighter 2 Movie that was only ever released in Japan, and in a total reversal from the live-action film, the game is really not good. You essentially just watch clips from the film from the perspective of one of Shadaloo's androids, occasionally hitting a scan button when the characters execute attacks against one another. At the end of the game, you finally do get to actually play Street Fighter in a match against Ryu, which you will almost certainly lose since the android totally sucks. A total flop of a game, but still an interesting little piece of Street Fighter history.
I don't give a shit.
So, all things considered, 1994 was a very eventful year for Street Fighter, with multiple movies, an animated series, and a line of action figures. But undoubtedly, the best thing to be released in 1994 with the Street Fighter name attached to it was the always awesome Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Even 30 years later, it's still one of the greatest fighting games ever made, and presumably always will be.
Of course!